Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Some ideas are not just dangerous to power, but are dangerous to existence, are not just threatening social order, but are threatening ontological stability, are not just challenging beliefs, but are challenging the structure of being itself, are ideas that when fully grasped, when completely understood, when thoroughly integrated into consciousness, produce not conversion or enlightenment, but erasure, produce the literal disappearance of those who think them, who follow them to their conclusion, who allow the ideas to transform consciousness in ways that eliminate the thinker, that dissolve the boundary between thought and reality in ways that make continued existence impossible. And the impossible is what happened, is what the records show before they were destroyed, before the archives were sealed, before the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being, threatened the continued presence of those who understood it, who saw what it revealed, who followed the logic to its endpoint and found that the endpoint was absence, was vanishing, was the ceasing to be that is not death but is something else, is something that leaves no body, no trace, no evidence except the gap where the person was, the empty space where consciousness used to organize reality. And the reality is what these ideas touch, is what they undermine, is what they show to be contingent on consciousness in ways that, when understood, completely cause consciousness to withdraw its support, to stop maintaining the structure, to allow the collapse that is not into death but into non-being, into the state that is not a state, that is not anything because it is the absence of the conditions that make anything possible. And the possible is what these ideas eliminate, is what they show to be dependent on not thinking them, on not understanding them, on maintaining the illusion that being is independent of belief, that existence is objective, that reality persists regardless of consciousness. And the regardless is what the dangerous philosophy denies, is what it shows to be false, is what it demonstrates through argument so compelling, through reasoning so rigorous, through insight so penetrating that those who follow it fully cease to provide the support that their own existence requires, cease to maintain the belief that sustains them, cease to participate in the collective agreement that makes reality real. And the real is what they stop being, is what they withdraw from, is what they are erased from, not by dying but by understanding, not by external force but by internal recognition, not by anything happening to them, but by their ceasing to happen, by their withdrawing the participation that made them exist. And the existing is what stops, is what ends, is what results in disappearance. That is literal, that is complete, that is leaving no body. Because there was never a body in the sense that is usually meant. There was only consciousness organizing sensations into the pattern called body, organizing perceptions into the pattern called world. And when that organizing stops, when that consciousness withdraws, when that participation ends, there is no body to leave behind, no corpse to bury, no physical trace, only the gap, the absence, the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the evidence shows, is what the witnesses describe before they too understand. before they too follow the reasoning, before they too are erased by the philosophy that is too dangerous to think, too powerful to contain, too true to refute. And the refutation is what is needed, is what authorities attempted, is what scholars tried to provide. But the refutation requires understanding the argument, requires following the reasoning, requires thinking the thoughts, and the thinking is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous not to society but to being, and being is what is at stake, is what the philosophy threatens, is what those who understand it cease to maintain, and the cessation is immediate, is total, is leaving no trace except the memory in others who did not fully understand, who stopped short of complete comprehension, who pulled back from the final step. And the step is what the censored chapter describes, is what was removed from every ethics textbook, is what was found to produce not moral transformation, but ontological dissolution, not changed behaviour, but disappeared persons. And the persons who disappeared were not killed, were not removed by force, were not eliminated by authorities, but simply ceased to be there, ceased to occupy space, ceased to organise reality, ceased to participate in existence. And the existence is. What requires participation is what depends on consciousness. Maintaining belief, maintaining engagement, maintaining the structures that make being possible. And when those structures are withdrawn, when that maintenance stops, when that participation ends, there is no being, there is no presence, there is only absence, and the absence is what remains when someone thinks the dangerous thought, understands the forbidden idea, follows the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not death but is erasure, is not ending but is never having been, is the withdrawal from existence that leaves no evidence except the gap, the space, the absence where someone was, and the was becomes uncertain, becomes questionable. Because if someone ceases to exist completely, ceases to have existed at all, then the memories of them become suspect, become unreliable, become the only trace of something that might not have happened. And the happening is what becomes uncertain, is what the philosophy undermines, is what it shows to depend on belief, on agreement, on the collective maintenance of narrative. And when one consciousness withdraws, when one participant stops maintaining, the others feel the gap. Notice the absence. Remember something that is no longer supported by reality. And the reality is what adjusts, is what fills in the gap, is what eliminates the traces, is what makes it as if the person never was, and the never was is the final stage, is what happens after the initial disappearance, is the completion of the erasure, is the adjustment of reality to the absence, is the closing of the gap, is the collective forgetting that is not intentional but is structural, is the result of reality being maintained by agreement, by consensus, by the collective participation of consciousness. And when one consciousness withdraws, the structure adjusts, the pattern reforms, the absence is absorbed, and what remains is less than memory, is less than trace, is the vague sense that something is missing, something is wrong, something has changed, but the what is inaccessible is already fading, is already being absorbed into the adjustment, and the adjustment is complete, is total, is making it as if the disappeared never existed, never participated, never contributed to the maintenance of reality. And the reality is what continues, is what persists, is what remains. After the erasure, but the remains is less, is diminished, is showing the gap to those who know to look, who understand what has been lost, who remember what the adjustment is erasing, and the erasure is ongoing, is continuous, is the fate of those who think the dangerous thought, who understand the forbidden philosophy, who follow the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is the ceasing to be that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the stopping of participation, is the ending of the maintenance that made existence possible. And the possible is what these people are no longer, is what they cease to be, is what they withdraw from by understanding too much, by seeing too clearly, by recognizing the contingency that makes being dependent on not seeing, on not understanding, on maintaining the illusion that existence is objective, that reality is independent, that being is not requiring constant support. And the support is what consciousness provides, is what participation maintains, is what the collective agreement enforces. And when one withdraws, when one sees through, when one understands the philosophy that makes people disappear, the withdrawal is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of understanding, and the understanding cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten, cannot be suppressed once achieved. And the achieving is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous. And the dangerous is why it was banned, why it was censored, why the chapter was removed, why the philosophers vanished, why the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being. Not because it challenged authority, but because it challenged existence. Not because it was false, but because it was too true, was revealing what must remain hidden, was exposing the dependence that must be denied, was showing the contingency that must be suppressed. And the suppression is what authorities attempted, is what the banning achieved, is what the censorship maintained. But the knowledge persists, is waiting, is available to those who seek it, who find the fragments, who reconstruct the argument, who follow the reasoning, and the following is what produces the disappearance, is what causes the erasure, is what makes those who understand vanish, not into death but into absence, not into somewhere else but into nowhere, not into another state but into the cessation of states, into the withdrawal from being that is not non-being but is the ending of the distinction, is the collapse of the boundary, is the recognition that being requires participation and that participation can be withdrawn. And the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy produces, is what those who understand fully cannot avoid, because the understanding is transformation, is alteration of consciousness in ways that make continued participation impossible, that make maintenance of existence unavoidable, that make the withdrawal automatic. And the automatic is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it spread, is what makes it necessary to suppress, because those who partially understand become dangerous to others, become carriers of fragments that if combined could produce the full understanding, could cause more disappearances, could threaten the collective maintenance that makes reality real. And the real is what depends on not understanding, on not thinking certain thoughts, on not following certain arguments, on stopping short of certain conclusions. And the conclusions are what the censored chapter reached, is what the disappeared philosophers understood, is what the dangerous philosophy contains, is what makes thinking it produce erasure, produce disappearance, produce the vanishing that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the ceasing to participate, is the ending of maintenance, is the stopping of the support that consciousness provides. To being, and being is what ends, is what those who think the dangerous thought cease to maintain, cease to be part of, cease to exist within. And the within is what they withdraw from, is what they cease to support, is what they allow to collapse for themselves. And the collapsing is their disappearance, is their erasure, is their vanishing. And the vanishing is complete, is total, is leaving no trace, no body, no evidence, only the gap, only the absence, only the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the dangerous philosophy produces, is what thinking it creates, is what understanding it causes. And the causing is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of comprehension, and comprehension is what produces disappearance, produces erasure, produces the vanishing that is not death but is ontological suicide, is the withdrawal from existence through understanding, is the ceasing to be through recognition, is the disappearance that happens when consciousness understands that being depends on not understanding, that existence requires ignorance, that reality is maintained through participation that can be withdrawn, and the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it banned, is what makes people disappear, and disappearing is what those who think it do, is what those who understand it become, is what those who follow it to its conclusion achieve, which is not enlightenment but is erasure, is not transcendence but is vanishing, is not liberation but is disappearance, is the ceasing to be, that is literal, that is complete, that is the result of understanding the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappearing is what it does, is what it causes, is what makes it the most dangerous idea, the most forbidden knowledge, the philosophy that breaks reality, that causes ontological suicide, that produces erasure through understanding. And understanding is what causes disappearance, is what makes people vanish, is what the banned philosophy does, and doing is what it continues to do, is what it will always do. To those who think it, who understand it, who follow it to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending of being through understanding, is ontological suicide through philosophy, is the dangerous thought that makes people disappear. And disappearing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappear they did, and disappear they will. Those who think it, those who understand it, those who follow the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is absence, is vanishing, is erasure, is disappearance. And disappearance is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is the philosophy that makes people disappear. And disappear is what they do, is what understanding causes, is what the dangerous thought produces, is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending through. Understanding is the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately, that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time. And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness. In the living voice, in the moment of speaking, where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false. That what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible. And recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system. And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning. And difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference, as we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be, and the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time, to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already is a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary but reveals the structure of what it supplements, reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie-writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, is writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend, can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate but that are nonetheless there in the text. And this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text, but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace. And the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down, and interpretation is therefore infinite, not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations, not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin. And this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient. And recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point, because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference, and this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive contexts and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organization of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, the organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness that shortens life, and the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete, because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns. When the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness, where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission. And the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages. And the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into. And the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants, who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples. And the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation. And the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honors the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma. And the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, Not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again. The sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy, from the earliest moments when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation, and the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people, but the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection, and the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them, and the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed. And the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity without this integration is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self. And the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural, but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation. And the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices, and the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face. And the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition. And recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition, and recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual, and the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity, and identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation, and mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually, and visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, When external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal. And the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors. And mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back. And what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable. And recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown. And the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had. And the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. The suffering is not in having little, but in having less, not in lacking, but in being surpassed, not in absence, but in comparison, and comparison is constant, is unavoidable, is built into perception, into cognition, into the social architecture of human life. Because humans are not isolated processes of absolute value, but are deeply embedded in networks where worth is relative, where position matters more than possession, where status is the thing being tracked, being measured, being fought over, and the fighting is exhausting, is endless, is producing anxiety that has no clear source except the presence of others, the visibility of their achievements, their possessions, their apparent happiness. And the apparent is what matters, is what comparison operates on. Because comparison does not have access to internal states, cannot measure actual satisfaction or genuine contentment, can only measure signals, displays, the external markers that are supposed to indicate success. And success is not absolute, is not a threshold that once crossed brings lasting peace, but is relative, is defined against the success of others, is meaningful only in context, only in relationship, only as position in a hierarchy that has no natural endpoints, no place where more is impossible, no level where comparison stops, and the stopping is what never happens, is what cannot happen, because there is always someone higher, always someone with more, always someone whose position makes one's own position feel insufficient, feel like failure, feel like falling behind. And behind is where comparison places everyone, except the very top, except the singular position that by definition only one can occupy. And even that position is temporary, is unstable, is vulnerable to being surpassed, to losing the lead, to falling back into the mass of strivers who are all measuring themselves against the same unreachable standard. And the unreachable is what drives the system, is what keeps everyone running, keeps everyone comparing, keeps everyone suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others, where they imagine others, where the displays and signals suggest others have arrived, and the arrival is illusion, is performance, is the curated presentation that social media perfects, that makes comparison more toxic than ever before. Because the comparison is now constant, is now unavoidable, is now the default activity of any moment with a screen. And the screen shows the highlight reel, shows the best moments, the peak experiences, the carefully selected and filtered images that are meant to represent lives, but are really representing brands, representing the performance of success. And the performance is what gets compared against reality, against the unfiltered experience of one's own life, with all its ordinariness, all its mundane moments, all the time that is not photogenic, not shareable, not worth displaying. And the asymmetry creates distortion, creates the sense that everyone else is doing better, is happier, is more successful, is living the life that one should be living, but is not. And the not is experienced as personal failure, as inadequacy, as evidence that something is wrong with the self, when really what is wrong is the comparison, is the measuring of internal experience against external display, of reality against performance, of the whole of one's life against the curated fragments of others' lives. And the fragments are not representative, are not honest, are not revealing the struggles, the doubts, the failures that are also present but are edited out, are kept private, are not part of the display. And so the display creates impossible standards, creates the sense that success should be constant, that happiness should be visible, that worth should be demonstrable. And demonstrable means comparable, means measurable against others, means existing in the public space where position can be assessed, where rank can be assigned, where the hierarchy becomes visible. And the visibility is what social media provides, is what makes the panopticon complete, is what ensures that everyone is always being watched, always being measured, always being compared, not by a central authority, but by everyone else, by the distributed surveillance of the network, where every post is a signal, every image is a claim, every update is a statement of position, and the position is what matters, is what gets evaluated, is what determines worth in the social economy, where attention is currency and visibility is power, and power is zero-sum, is rivalrous, is gained by some at the expense of others, because attention is finite, is limited, is allocated according to comparison, according to who is most interesting, most successful, most worth watching. And the worth watching is what everyone is competing for, is what drives the performance, is what makes authenticity impossible. Because authenticity does not optimize for attention, does not maximize engagement, does not win the comparison, and winning is what the system demands, is what the architecture incentivizes, is what the algorithms reward. And the rewards go to those who perform best, who display most effectively, who signal status most clearly, and the clarity is achieved through excess, through conspicuous consumption, through the demonstration of resources, of connections, of experiences that others do not have. And the not having is what makes the display valuable, is what makes it worth envying, is what triggers the comparison that produces the anxiety that drives more performance, more display, more competition. And the competition is the prison, is the trap, is the system that has no exit, because exiting means becoming invisible, means losing position, means falling behind. And behind is unbearable, is the failure state, is where the losers are. And no one wants to be a loser. No one wants to be the one who is surpassed, who is left behind, who is forgotten. And the forgetting is what happens to those who stop performing, who stop displaying, who drop out of the comparison. And dropping out is not freedom but is erasure, is not peace but is irrelevance, is not escape but is defeat. And so most stay in, most keep performing, most keep comparing, most keep suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others. And the seeing is continuous, is unavoidable, is the default state of consciousness. In an environment where everyone's position is visible, where everyone's success is displayed, where everyone's life is performance, and the performance is what gets internalized, becomes the standard against which the self is measured. And the measuring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every context, whenever others are present, or even when they are not present but are represented, are visible through screens, through feeds, through the endless stream of signals that constitute social media. And social media is the panopticon perfected, is the prison where everyone is guard and prisoner simultaneously, is watching and being watched, is judging and being judged, is comparing and being compared. And the comparing is the punishment, is the suffering, is the anxiety that has no clear cause except the presence of others, the visibility of their position, the evidence that they have what one does not have, and the not having is experienced as deprivation, as relative deprivation, as the sense that one is lacking not in absolute terms but in comparison to others, and the comparison is the only terms that matter, is the only measurement that counts. Because humans are social, are tribal, are wired to care about position, about rank, about where they stand in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is not natural, is not fixed, is not based on any inherent quality, but is constructed through comparison, through the constant evaluation of signals, of displays, of the markers that are supposed to indicate worth. And worth is not intrinsic, is not internal, is not a property of the self, but is assigned, is determined by others, is the result of comparison, of measurement, of the social process that ranks everyone according to criteria that are arbitrary, that are culturally specific, that are manipulable. And the manipulation is what social media enables, is what allows anyone to perform success, to display status, to signal position regardless of underlying reality. And the reality is hidden, is private, is not part of the comparison. And so the comparison is always distorted, is always measuring performance against performance, display against display, rather than reality against reality. And the reality is that most people are struggling, are anxious, are feeling inadequate, are suffering from the same comparison that they are inflicting on others, and the inflicting is not intentional, is not malicious, is just participation, is just performing, is just displaying the signals that are required to maintain position, to avoid falling behind, to stay in the game. And the game is the prison, is the system that has no winners, because there is no end point, no level of success that brings peace, no amount of status that ends comparison, because comparison is relative, is always finding someone higher, always finding new metrics, always raising the bar, and the raising is what makes enough impossible, is what ensures that satisfaction is temporary, is what converts every achievement into baseline, into the new normal that is no longer impressive, no longer enviable, no longer worth displaying because everyone else has caught up, has matched the signal, has equaled the performance, and so new signals are needed, new displays are required, new forms of status must be pursued, and the pursuit is endless, is exhausting, is producing the anxiety that characterizes modern life, the sense that one is always falling behind, always insufficient, always failing to measure up. And the measuring up is the problem, is the trap, is the prison, because up is infinite, is unlimited, is always higher than wherever one currently is. And so the climbing never ends, never reaches a summit, never arrives at a place where comparison stops, where enough is recognized as enough, where peace is possible, and peace is not possible as long as comparison continues. As long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position always matters, is wired into human psychology, is part of the social brain that evolved to track status, to monitor hierarchy, to care intensely about where one stands relative to others, and the relative is the only measure that counts, is the only information that the social brain processes, is why absolute improvements in living standards do not produce corresponding improvements in happiness. Because happiness is relative, is determined by comparison, is about position not possession, and position is zero-sum, is gained by some at the expense of others, is the ranking that ensures most people feel inadequate most of the time. Because most people are not at the top, are not in the elite positions, are somewhere in the middle or the bottom, are below someone, are being surpassed by someone, are losing the comparison to someone, and the someone is always visible, is always present, is always there to trigger the anxiety, to produce the envy, to create the suffering that comes from measuring oneself against others and finding oneself lacking. And the lacking is not real, is not objective, is only relative, is only meaningful in comparison. But the comparison is what makes it feel real, what makes it feel like failure, what makes it feel like something is wrong, something needs to change, something must be improved. And the improvement is pursued, is worked toward, is achieved. And the achievement brings temporary satisfaction, brings a brief moment of feeling successful, of feeling adequate, of feeling like enough. But the enough is temporary, is quickly replaced by new comparison, by new awareness of those who are higher, who have more, who have surpassed. And the surpassing is the trigger, is what resets the baseline, is what converts achievement into inadequacy, is what makes the prison inescapable. Because escaping requires not just achieving more, but achieving more than everyone else. And everyone else is also striving, is also comparing, is also trying to escape through achievement. And so the competition intensifies, the standards rise, the bar keeps moving, and the moving is what makes peace impossible, makes satisfaction temporary, makes enough unattainable, because enough is not an absolute measure, but is relative, is defined by comparison, is determined by position, and position is always vulnerable, is always threatened, is always at risk of being lost. And the risk creates anxiety, creates vigilance, creates the constant monitoring of others, of their signals, of their displays, of any evidence that they're gaining, advancing, surpassing, and the surpassing is what must be prevented, is what drives the performance, is what makes rest impossible, makes dropping out unthinkable, makes the prison unescapable, except by those rare individuals who somehow break free of comparison, who somehow stop measuring themselves against others, who somehow find peace in their own position, regardless of where that position is in the hierarchy. And these individuals are rare, are exceptions, are not the norm, because the norm is comparison, is the constant measurement, is the anxiety that comes from always being aware of others, of their position, of their apparent success. And the apparent is what matters, is what the social brain responds to, is what triggers the envy. And envy is information, is the signal that someone else has something valuable, something worth having, something that could improve one's own position. And the position is what envy is tracking, is what it is designed to make salient, is the gap that needs closing, and the closing is pursued through imitation, through acquisition, through the striving to match what the envied other has, to equal their position, to eliminate the gap. But the gap never closes, is never eliminated, because as soon as one gap is closed, another opens. As soon as one person is matched, another surpasses. As soon as one goal is achieved, the goalposts move, and the moving is what makes the prison permanent, makes the suffering chronic, makes the anxiety inescapable, because the architecture of social comparison is not designed for peace, is not optimized for satisfaction, is designed for striving, for competition, for the endless pursuit of position. And the pursuit is the function, is what the system needs, is what makes the hierarchy dynamic, what keeps people climbing, what ensures that those at the top are always being challenged, always being pursued, always at risk of being overtaken. And the risk is what makes their position valuable, is what makes status worth having, is what creates the scarcity that makes position meaningful. And meaningful means enviable, means desirable, means worth suffering for. And the suffering is universal, is experienced at every level, is not limited to those at the bottom, but is felt even at the top. Because even at the top there is comparison. There is the awareness of others who are close, who are threatening, who might surpass, and the might creates anxiety, creates the need to defend position, to maintain distance, to keep performing, keep displaying, keep signalling status. And the signalling is exhausting, is requiring constant effort, constant vigilance, constant awareness of how one is being perceived, how one is being measured, how one's position is being evaluated by others who are always comparing, always measuring, always judging. And the judging is mutual, is reciprocal. Is everyone evaluating everyone else? Is the distributed surveillance that makes the panopticon total, that makes escape impossible, that ensures everyone is always in the prison, always being compared, always suffering from the awareness that others are watching, measuring, judging, and that the judgment might be negative, might find one lacking, might assign a lower position than one wants, than one deserves, than one has worked for. And the work is never enough, is never sufficient, is never achieving the permanent security that would allow rest, would allow peace, would allow the comparison to stop mattering. Because the comparison never stops mattering, is always relevant, is always the measure that counts, is what determines worth in the social economy, where position is everything, where rank is identity, where hierarchy is reality, and reality is constructed through comparison, through the constant measurement that assigns everyone a place, a position, a rank. And the rank is always provisional, always temporary, always vulnerable to change, to being surpassed, to falling. And the falling is what everyone fears, is what drives the anxiety, is what makes the prison work. Because the prison is not a place, but is a process, is the constant comparison that measures everyone against everyone else and finds everyone lacking. Because lacking is relative, is inevitable, is the necessary result of a system where only one can be first, where most must be middle, where someone must be last and the last is where no one wants to be, is the position that is avoided, that is fled from, that creates the most anxiety, the most suffering, the most desperate striving to escape. And the escape is pursued through the same means that created the prison, through comparison, through performance, through display, through the signalling of status that is supposed to improve position, but only reinforces the system, only strengthens the prison, only ensures that comparison continues, that measurement persists, that the anxiety remains. And the remaining is permanent, is chronic, is the condition of social existence in an environment where everyone is visible, where position is trackable, where comparison is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes the suffering universal, is what ensures that peace is rare, that satisfaction is temporary, that enough is never enough, because enough is not absolute but is relative, is determined by comparison, is defined by position, and position is always being measured, always being evaluated, always being compared, and the comparison is the prison, is the trap, is the source of suffering that has no solution except the impossible one of stopping comparison, of ceasing to measure oneself against others, of finding worth that is internal rather than relative, that is intrinsic rather than assigned, that is independent of position, independent of rank, independent of the hierarchy that comparison creates and maintains, and the maintenance is collective. Is everyone participating? Everyone contributing? Everyone reinforcing the system by comparing, by displaying, by performing, by caring about position? And the caring is what makes the prison work, is what keeps everyone trapped, is what ensures that suffering continues, that anxiety persists, that peace remains impossible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position will always matter, will always be salient, will always be the measure that counts. Because humans are social, are hierarchical, are wired to care about rank, about status, about where they stand relative to others. And the relative is the only measurement that has ever mattered, is the only comparison that counts, is the prison that has no walls but is inescapable, is the trap that has no lock but cannot be opened, is the suffering that has no cause except comparison, except the presence of others, except the visibility of their position. And the position is always visible, is always present, is always there to measure against, to fall short of, to suffer from the awareness that someone is higher, someone has more, someone is better, and the better is what one is not, is what one is lacking, is what the comparison reveals, and the revealing is the suffering, is the prison, is the condition that cannot be escaped as long as comparison continues, and comparison will continue, must continue, is built into the architecture of social existence, is the foundation of the hierarchy, is the mechanism that assigns position. And position is everything, is worth, is identity, is the measure of the self, and the self is always being measured, always being compared, always being found insufficient. And the insufficient is the prison, is the trap, is the suffering that is universal, that is inescapable, that is the cost of being social, of being visible, of being in comparison with others. And the comparison is the prison, and the prison is where everyone lives, where everyone suffers, where peace is impossible and enough is never enough. Sleep became crime, became the transgression that was punished, became evidence of weakness, of submission, of the failure to maintain consciousness. And consciousness was mandatory, was enforced, was the law that governed every moment. And the moments were extended, were stretched beyond the natural rhythm, were pushed into the realm where bodies fail, where minds break, where the boundary between waking and dreaming dissolves. Not because dreaming invades waking, but because waking becomes dreamlike, becomes hallucinatory, becomes the state where reality is uncertain, where perceptions are unreliable, where the distinction between internal and external collapses, and the collapse is what the society created, is what the prohibition of sleep produced, is the transformation of consciousness into something that is no longer consciousness but is not unconsciousness either, is the in-between state, the liminal condition, the waking psychosis that became normal, that became the baseline, that became what it meant to be human in a civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where closing the eyes was crime, and closing the eyes for too long was capital offence, was punishable by death, by the removal from a society of those who could not maintain wakefulness, who succumbed to the biological imperative, who allowed exhaustion to overcome will. And will was what the society demanded, was what the ideology required, was the belief that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely through discipline, through training, through the suppression of the body's demands. And the demands were treated as weaknesses, were seen as failures, were evidence of insufficient commitment to the collective, to the cause, to the perpetual vigilance that the society required. And required is what sleep was not, was what rest could not be, was what unconsciousness represented, which was vulnerability, was the moment when defences were down, when control was lost, when the individual was not contributing, not producing, not maintaining awareness. And awareness was productivity, was loyalty, was the proof that one was serving the state, serving the ideology, serving the vision of human transcendence that the society claimed to be pursuing. And pursuing required wakefulness, required constant alertness, required the elimination of the hours that were wasted in sleep, that were lost to unconsciousness, that were not serving any purpose except the biological. And the biological was what the society was trying to overcome, was trying to transcend, was treating as limitation rather than as necessity. And necessity is what sleep is what the body requires, is what the brain needs in order to function. But function was redefined, was made to include the dysfunctional, was incorporating the breakdown as the new normal, as the state that everyone inhabited, as the condition that became universal. Once sleep was eliminated, once rest was forbidden, once the law made unconsciousness illegal. And illegal is what saved no one, because the law cannot change biology, cannot alter the requirements of the nervous system, cannot make consciousness sustainable beyond the limits that evolution has set. And the limits were being reached, were being exceeded, were being violated by the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And the wakefulness was not wakefulness in the ordinary sense, was not the alert consciousness of the rested mind, but was the deteriorating awareness of the exhausted brain, was the fragmented attention of the sleep-deprived nervous system, was the hallucinatory perception of the consciousness that has been pushed beyond its capacity, and the capacity was exceeded in everyone, was creating a society of people who were technically awake but were not functioning, were not processing reality accurately, were not distinguishing clearly between what was real and what was imagined, and the imagined was becoming more present, more vivid, more compelling than the real, because the real requires cognitive resources that sleep deprivation destroys, that exhaustion eliminates, that the prohibition of rest makes unavailable. And unavailable is what clear thinking became, is what rational judgment became, is what accurate perception became, and perception was altered, was degraded, was transformed into something unreliable. And unreliable is what everyone became, is what the society consisted of, is the population of people who could not trust their senses, who could not distinguish memory from hallucination, who could not separate thought from perception. And the separation is what sleep deprivation destroys, is what the elimination of rest undermines, is what the prohibition of unconsciousness makes impossible. Because consciousness requires unconsciousness, requires the alternation, requires the rhythm of waking and sleeping, and the rhythm was disrupted, was eliminated, was replaced by continuous wakefulness that was not sustainable, that was producing breakdown, that was creating the waking psychosis that became the normal state. And normal is what psychosis became, is what hallucination became, is what the confusion between internal and external became. Because when everyone is experiencing it, when the entire society is inhabiting the same altered state, then the altered becomes the baseline, becomes what normal means, becomes the shared reality. And reality is what becomes questionable, becomes uncertain, becomes the thing that cannot be agreed upon, because everyone is perceiving differently, is hallucinating differently, is confused in different ways. And the confusion is compounded by the fact that communication requires cognitive resources that are depleted, that language processing depends on neural functions that exhaustion impairs, that understanding requires attention, that sleep deprivation fragments, and fragments are what communication became, is what speech became, is what meaning became. Because meaning requires coherence, and coherence requires rest, and rest was forbidden, was illegal, was the crime that was punished, and punishment was surveillance, was the monitoring of eyelids, was the detection of the micro-sleeps that the body forces when sleep is denied too long, when exhaustion becomes total, when the brain shuts down for seconds, for moments, for the brief lapses that are involuntary, that are the body's attempt to get what it needs, and the needs were unmet, were systematically denied, were treated as crimes, and crimes were what the microsleeps became, were what led to arrest, to detention, to the punishments that were designed to prevent sleep, to force wakefulness, to maintain consciousness, through pain, through stimulation, through the interventions that kept people awake, but also kept them deteriorating, kept them declining, kept them moving toward the psychosis that was inevitable. That was the outcome of sustained sleep deprivation. That was what the society was creating systematically, deliberately, through the prohibition of sleep, through the criminalization of unconsciousness, through the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And wakefulness was the goal, was the ideal, was what the ideology claimed would produce the new human, the transcendent consciousness, the being that did not need rest, that could function indefinitely, that could maintain awareness without the interruption of sleep. But the maintaining was not happening, was not achievable, was producing instead the opposite of transcendence, was producing breakdown, was producing the dissolution of the boundaries that make perception reliable, that make thought coherent, that make reality stable. And stability was lost, was sacrificed, was eliminated by the prohibition of sleep. And sleep was what the body forced eventually, was what happened despite the law, despite the surveillance, despite the punishments. Because biology is not subject to legislation, is not obeying ideology, is not responsive to will when the will is demanding the impossible. And the impossible is what the society was demanding, is what the law was requiring, is what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what did not prevent it, did not eliminate it, only pushed it underground, only made it covert, only created the conditions where people were sleeping in secret, were hiding their rest, were taking the micro-sleeps when surveillance was momentarily absent, were finding the brief moments of unconsciousness that were necessary for survival. And survival was what was barely being achieved, was what was requiring the violations, was what made the law unenforceable, because a law that requires the impossible is a law that everyone breaks, and everyone was breaking it, was sleeping briefly, was resting when possible, was taking the unconsciousness that the body demanded, and the demanding was biological, was not subject to social control, was not responsive to ideological requirements, and the requirements were being violated systematically, universally, by everyone, including the enforcers, including the guards who were supposed to maintain surveillance, who were supposed to detect the sleepers, but who were themselves exhausted, were themselves sleep-deprived, were themselves unable to maintain the vigilance that the system required, and the system was failing, was collapsing, was producing the opposite of what it intended, was creating not the transcendent consciousness, but the disintegrating consciousness, not the enhanced human, but the broken human, not the society of perpetual wakefulness, but the society of perpetual psychosis. And psychosis was normal, was universal, was the shared condition, was what it meant to live in the civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where unconsciousness was crime, and crime was what everyone committed, was what everyone needed to commit, was what survival required, and survival was barely possible, was requiring constant violation, was dependent on breaking the law, and the law was unenforceable, was impractical, was based on a false premise, the premise that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely, that sleep was optional, that rest was unnecessary, and unnecessary is what sleep is not, is what the body demonstrates, is what the breakdown proves, and the breakdown was universal, was affecting everyone, was creating the society that was nominally awake, but was really suspended in the in-between state, in the liminal zone where waking and dreaming merge, where reality becomes uncertain, where hallucination becomes common, where the distinction between internal and external dissolves, and the dissolving is what happens when sleep is forbidden, when rest is denied, when the body's requirements are treated as crimes, and crimes they became, crimes that everyone committed, crimes that were necessary for survival, crimes that proved the law to be impossible, the ideology to be false, the premise to be flawed. And flawed is what the society was, is what the experiment produced, is what made sleep illegal and consciousness mandatory, and created the civilization that was technically awake but was really psychotic, was really hallucinating, was really confused, was really demonstrating that humans cannot transcend the need for sleep, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely, cannot function without rest. And rest was what was forbidden, was what was illegal, was what was crime, and crime is what saved those who committed it, what allowed survival, what made continued existence possible, and possible is what the society was barely, was what was achieved only through systematic violation of the law that made sleep illegal. And illegal is what sleep remained, is what the law maintained, is what the ideology required. But required is not the same as possible, is not the same as achievable, is not the same as sustainable, and sustainable is what the prohibition of sleep was not, is what the criminalization of unconsciousness was not, is what the society that made sleep illegal was not, and not sustainable is what became apparent, is what the breakdown demonstrated, is what the universal psychosis proved, that sleep cannot be eliminated, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be maintained indefinitely, that the body has requirements that ideology cannot overcome, that law cannot change, that punishment cannot eliminate. And eliminate is what the society tried to do, tried to achieve, tried to enforce, and enforcement failed, was impossible, was producing the opposite of the intended result, was creating not transcendence but breakdown, not enhancement but deterioration, not the new human but the psychotic human. And psychotic is what humans become when rest is forbidden, when sleep is illegal, when consciousness is mandatory, and mandatory is what made everyone criminal, made everyone violator, made everyone guilty, and guilty of survival, guilty of biology, guilty of being human. And human requires sleep, requires rest, requires the alternation of consciousness and unconsciousness. And unconsciousness is what the law forbade, what the society criminalized, what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what it remained, is what the law maintained, even as everyone violated it, even as survival required it, even as the breakdown demonstrated that the law was impossible, that the ideology was false, that humans cannot live without sleep, cannot function without rest, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely. And indefinitely is what the society tried, is what the law required, is what the ideology demanded. And demanded is not achieved, is not sustainable, is not possible, is what the society that made sleep illegal discovered, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness proved, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative, and imperative cannot be legislated away, cannot be ideologically overcome, cannot be made illegal without making everyone criminal, and criminal is what everyone became, is what survival required, is what made the society where sleep was illegal, impossible, unsustainable, self-defeating, and defeating is what happened, is what the prohibition achieved, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that collapsed, that failed, that demonstrated that humans need sleep, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be mandatory, that the society where sleep was illegal was impossible, and impossible is what it proved to be, is what the experiment demonstrated, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness showed, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans cannot live without unconsciousness, cannot function without sleep, cannot survive when rest is forbidden, and forbidden is what sleep was, is what the law made it, is what the society tried to enforce, and enforce is what failed, is what was impossible, is what made the society where sleep was illegal collapse, fail, demonstrate that sleep cannot be criminalized, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory is what destroyed them, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that proved it was impossible, that demonstrated it was unsustainable, that showed it was doomed. And doomed is what the society was, is what making sleep illegal created, is the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness and discovered that unconsciousness cannot be eliminated, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans need to sleep, and sleep is what they did. Despite the law, despite the prohibition, despite the illegality, they slept, they rested, they took the unconsciousness that was necessary. And necessary is what sleep is what the society that made sleep illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is what the experiment showed, that sleep cannot be illegal, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory consciousness is impossible, is unsustainable, is what destroyed the society, is what made sleep illegal and proved it could not be and could not be, is what sleep being illegal was, is what the civilization discovered, is what the society learned, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative. An imperative cannot be made illegal, cannot be criminalized, cannot be forbidden. Is what the society where sleep was illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is that sleep is necessary, and necessary cannot be illegal.